Thank you all so much. I understand that you had a really great meeting on opioid addiction, and I want to thank Mayor Benjamin for helping lead the conference, and thank you for your participation in it. I think everybody has a fairly good sense of what our priorities are and what our great needs are, and of course opioid addiction is one of them. But certainly I could have before last weekend, and I certainly can now, talk about the vulnerabilities of our infrastructure not being up to snuff. In the city of New Orleans right now, we are in the middle of an infrastructure failure in our sewer and water system that is very old, much like the systems that you have that are compromised. It requires a lot of attention, a lot of work, and a lot of investment. So we're going to talk about that now, which is why it was important for me to get back over here. I may have to leave again, but I'm going to start this event off, and I want to thank again, all the mayors for being here. It's pretty clear to all of us who are on the ground that our roads, our bridges, our energy grids, our sewer, water, and drainage systems continue to crumble after decades of disinvestment. And at the same time, our populations are growing rapidly, and our burdens are becoming greater, compounding the need for more investment. And public investment in infrastructure, I think this is the critical. Public investments in infrastructure make our communities safer, certainly create jobs, help small businesses, and expand, grows our economy, and provides for the nation's national security and for our personal security. Public investment in infrastructure is going to make Americans' lives better, not just for those living in cities, but those who work in them and the communities that surround them. And I think all of us share a very firm belief that mayors and local governments continue to lead in ways that finance our infrastructure. And we're working with the private sector when possible to leverage every tax dollar when we can, and we're balancing our budgets every year. We all need the federal government to join with us, the local government, the private sector, in our states to support the major needs that we're having in crumbling infrastructure, and so that we can guarantee the projects will be completed on time and on budget. So with that, we have a great panel. Rahm Emanuel has helped lead this effort across the country, and so to help frame this discussion, I'm going to call on him. He has spent considerable time and effort on challenging and financing and working hard to make sure that we stay focused on this issue. He led a special task force to examine the issues, working in partnerships with the Clinton Global Initiative. And so, Mayor Emanuel, I want to call on you. Thank you so much for being here. If you also can weave into this an update to the extent that you would like to about the issue you're having with immigration, try to figure out how to do both of those at the same time, if you don't mind. We wanted to kind of stay on infrastructure, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to address that as well. Of course, Mayor Reed is with us. Kasim, it's great to see you, and then we'll follow up after that. Y'all, Mayor Rahm Emanuel.
Thanks, Mitch. Look, we're all facing this, and this isn't different for any one of us in a position. My first premise, whether it's on water, schools, roads, public transportation, or aviation, if it runs, the way I say it, if it runs on runways, roads, or rails, we're going to invest in it. Now, for Chicago, I've given 2 major addresses laying out each time a 4-year plan, very specifically by area. But I'm up front with everybody. You can't do public investment in public transportation or anything on the cheap. It's just not possible. But we have deployed different vehicles of financing it, so there's not a one way to do it. It's not just a gas tax approach. In certain places, we have raised fees that are directly for something new. Other places, we've taken changes to the central office and then used the savings of that into investments. Obviously, at the federal level, we have worked with what I think are 2 great tools. I'm a big believer in the TIFIA loan program. It has been, I think all of us, a tremendous tool for the city of Chicago, both at the aviation place as well as in public transportation. Now, the good thing, and I will say this while there's other factors that go into it, JLL economist did a study of economies of major cities, and Chicago's economy, since we've embarked on our public infrastructure investment, has grown faster each year for the last 5 years than both New York, D.C., or the United States of America. And we have the first 5 years, or first 4 years, we did 42,000 jobs in infrastructure. and we've laid out a plan for another 60,000. Without getting too bogged down in it, we are replacing on water 900 miles of water pipe, 670 miles of sewer pipe, 167,000 catch basin, and the 2 largest water filtration plants in the world. We raised rates locally, but since we distribute water into the suburbs, almost 50% of the infrastructure is being paid by suburban systems. That's a straight up, we took care of that problem. It's a 10-year, $4.8 billion project, and we indexed it, meaning that after the fees went up, it's indexed deflation, so nobody has to go back and have to play the politics of raising water fees ever again. It's in the system at inflation. Now, we have done other things, and I don't want to go through the length of them, but, and that also paves, so you know, we do 100 miles of road paving when you're done with the water work and the sewer work. So we're doing it because we raised the water rates, we're getting a lot of road work out of that system as well. I do believe in one other thing. We set up an infrastructure trust, a bank. It has done a number of projects. The most successful one to date, we used the bank to finance our mass transit system now. Last year, I think November it went online, has complete 4G throughout the entire system. So if you have a tunnel system, and it has been a tremendous asset, not just for the employees, employers love it, because people are, as I say, the train is the new office. There's no excuse for not getting the work done. And employees hate it, but employers are really happy I did it. That's a joke, lighten up, guys. But so we did that, and that's a different vehicle, and we've used it also in our climate change. We're now at 52 million square feet under retrofit, and we used the infrastructure bank for that effort as well. So those are just examples of the different vehicles of what I think are important on doing work in that area. Our mass transit system has been a traditional federal, state, and local effort, and the aviation system, when we're done, all said and done, we've embarked at Midway using retail sales to do a major expansion in Midway, modernization. We're already up 1,000 employees or 750 employees, and we'll hit 1,000 by the end of the year. New employees on top of what we have. We're building a whole new security system, new garage, and moving the train station closer into the terminal system. We did a thing at O'Hare using a runway completion and modernization, and by 2019, with our runway system, we have added the capacity of Midway Airport to O'Hare Airport. So as I always say, we're the only city that built a third airport in the last decade. But whether it's a local revenue, whether it's a central office, whether it was an infrastructure bank, whether it was a TIFIA loan program, and whether it was just being upfront, raising taxes or fees, we have to find different revenue sources for all this effort. But what is happening, and we were talking earlier this morning at breakfast, we are short workers in Chicago. You know, we have now $23 billion of private sector. It's the Tribune, which says this is a historic moment in Chicago, $24 billion of mega real estate deals going on. All of them you can tie to what's going on, we're doing on mass transit or road work. It is the only place outside of talent you can unlock a tremendous amount of private sector investment. We've never had $24 billion or $22 billion at one time of mega projects in the city of Chicago. 5 of them going on simultaneously, all near mass transit and access. So this public sector investment that Mitch has pointed out, we all know this, but it unlocks all this private sector investment that unless we do it, they can't do it on their own. I am a big believer in P3, public-private partnerships. I don't think it's the panacea that was sold. I leave one thought. I think if you look at what's going on with Washington and healthcare, et cetera, they're going to turn to taxes. I don't see them raising gas tax. I just don't believe it. I think we should be a very strong advocate for the repatriation dollars, because it's the only place you're going to get public money that can be earmarked for public transportation. Some people have good working relationships with their governors, some do not. And so if we want public dollars for public transportation or any kind of capital investment, I think we should be singularly focused about the repatriation issue as a singular source for transportation as kind of an agenda item. So I'll close on one thing on the, Mitch, and I'll say one thing about our lawsuit. And if anybody wants to talk about it, your city or the organization, I always refer to us as a welcoming city, not a sanctuary city.
That's right.
I never use that term. We're a welcoming city. 100 years ago, my grandfather on my mother's side came to Chicago, 13 years old, by himself, fleeing the pogroms of Eastern Europe. He got a 4th grade education. His grandson is the mayor of the city he declared home that he couldn't pronounce when he left Moldova. Don't anybody ever tell you that America's not a great city, and a great country, rather, and Chicago, in my view, is a great city. But the fact is, we welcome people, whether they cross the Atlantic, whether they cross the Rio, whether they cross the Pacific, or whether they make their way through the Mississippi. If you believe tomorrow can be better for your children, I want Chicago to be your home. I always want it to be your home. And we won't turn our back on our past because it's actually the prologue for the future. I also believe in community policing. And if communities won't work with police officers, we won't have community policing. So to ask us to pick between our values and our principles is not something we're going to do. I would hope individually or collectively, whether you are or not a sanctuary city, or welcoming city rather, I really would hope we would take a stand, because I think they're asking us to make a false choice between the principles of community policing and the values of welcoming people from whatever part of the world or every part of the United States or every part of the Americas are there. I took that stand. I'm comfortable with the stand I've taken. I think it's not only right on a whole host of checkpoints. We're in the process, but because of the Byrne grant, we're asking the judge to make a ruling by September 5th when the application has to be due. So if anybody individually or the association wants to take a position, that has to happen pretty quickly because we're going to court.
Ram, thank you so much. A couple things just to, let's go backwards. A group of us had a number of meetings with the Department of Homeland Security and also the Attorney General on this very issue. We held a press conference outside of the Department of Justice. Mayor Adler was there and a couple of other mayors as well. And so we hear what you're saying, and we're going to talk about this tomorrow in our meeting and come out of it with a decision. But thank you so much for that work. Just another note on the infrastructure investments, the public infrastructure creating private sector investment, you're sitting in an example of it. Before Katrina hit, this entire hotel, actually, if you can imagine it, faced the Superdome. The front of it was that way. And after Katrina hit, when we began to rebuild the city, with a $75 million Tiger grant, we built a streetcar line that was an extension that's right outside of this door. And when we decided to do that, this hotel actually completely flipped its front door to that way and put $500 million in renovating this particular space. And along this corridor, which is less than a mile long, in a very short period of time, $2 billion of private sector investment followed that $75 million Tiger grant. And that's just one example. There are a lot. As you know, we're rebuilding the entire city. And wherever there was public investment, right after, especially with rail, or if you do this on the port or you do it with your airports, private sector investment's going to come in and the incentive is terrific. So, Ram, thank you for that. We appreciate your leadership. Mayor Reed has been, as you know, one of our leaders on infrastructure in the country. Kasim, thank you for being here to moderate the next panel. So I'm going to turn this over to him, and then after that, we'll get into questions and answers. Mayor Reed, thank you so much. I appreciate it. The floor is yours.
Well, Mr. President, I want to just take a point of personal privilege. I don't know if we did it yesterday, but we didn't do it today. I don't think we could be in a better city focusing on infrastructure because of what it's meant to New Orleans and to the country and the job you have had of overseeing it. But I just wanted to thank you for your moral leadership as you showed mayoral courage in removing the Confederate symbols and really taking that on. We talked when you were going through that process. I think the room should give him an enormous round of applause. Just
Thank you. Thank you.
And Ram, I just want to thank you. For years, you have been leading and being on the cutting edge, helping us and always taking our calls when we were looking to move our cities forward in the infrastructure space. In our own city, we have about $12 billion worth of capital projects moving forward at this time. We've got a $6 billion capital program at Hartsfield-Jackson, the largest expansion of MARTA at $2.6 billion, the ninth largest system in the country. And I think, like all of you, our list goes on and on. And so what we're here to focus on really are how do we make sure, as there's a conversation nationally about a $1 trillion infrastructure effort, that we are not simply put in a system where that is a tax incentive-based system. And I think that we need to work right now to make sure that however it's funded, whether it's from repatriating $2 trillion and using $250 million of those to fund infrastructure efforts, that the bottom line is that it is dollars going to cities and states for specific projects. So what we know is during the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, about 10% of $784 billion was invested in infrastructure projects that went to cities through Tiger, through TIFIA, and other forms, and that accounted for 35% of the verifiable jobs. And so today we're going to have a conversation about making sure that cities keep the tax exemption from municipal bonds. As Mayor Benjamin likes to say, don't mess with our bonds. And I think that that just says it plainly. Don't mess with our bonds. I think that's a message that our president could understand. Keep the deductibility of state and local taxes. This allows us to raise the revenues that are necessary to keep our cities moving. We want to pay off bonds and do routine maintenance, and then we want to use successful P3 contracts and providers to make sure we have strong partnerships with the private sector. I think that we need to have a unified voice to fix the hole in our highway and transit funds. It's headed towards $100 billion, and this issue is going to be right up on us in exactly 3 years' time. We want to take advantage of opportunities that arise, increase the PFC authority. As the mayor of the city with the busiest passenger airport in the world, we definitely support that effort. As for what should be done in an infrastructure plan for action by Congress, this is what this panel is going to focus on today, and we're really fortunate. Our panelists will help inform us on this question for our discussions today and as well as tomorrow, and as we move around and talk together privately. Specifically, we've asked our 3 speakers to help us on 3 items. We want to share their recommendations on what should be in any new major infrastructure bill so that we can speak clearly and forcefully. We want to be advised on what mayors can do to help get such a package moving and enacted as quickly as we can in Congress. With this background, I now want to bring our panelists into the conversation. First, we have a distinguished gentleman, Brent Booker. I'm pleased to introduce our first speaker, Brent Booker. He is the Secretary of Treasurer of North America's Building Trade Union. Brent Booker is a proud member of LIUNA Local 795 and a third-generation laborer. NAP2 serves to coordinate 14 international craft unions, more than 300 state and local building trades councils, representing nearly 3 million members in the United States of America. Brent is joining us this afternoon to speak more about North America's building trades commitment to apprenticeship and how we can work with NAP2 nationally and in your cities to provide meaningful career opportunities for our residents and citizens. Please join me in giving a warm welcome for Brent Booker. Brent, welcome.
Thank you, Mayor Reed. Thank you Mayor Landrieu for the opportunity to be here and share some of our thoughts and talk to you all a little bit about what we're doing at North America's Building Trades. Like Mayor Reed said, talking about apprenticeship and training and talking about some of the creative financing that we're engaged with on a daily basis. And finally, the third thing I want to touch on is our advocacy and the work we're doing on the ground and a new vehicle that we've created and share with you and seek out new partnerships. We've got lots of partnerships with the mayors in this room, but at the Building Trades, we're always looking for a new partner. We're always looking for a new way to attack a problem. Clearly, we have a problem in this country with infrastructure, and we are falling behind. We've been falling behind for years, if not decades. You look at the world economy, the global economy, and the others around the globe as to what type of infrastructure spending they're doing, the commitments they're making to infrastructure, and we're not number one in that, and we need to be. You know, one of the things that we do and that I think that we do probably the best in the world is training. At the Building Trades, we have, like Mayor Reed said, we represent 3 million members. We spend $1.2 billion annually through our joint labor management training initiatives and our training funds, our JATCs. And we do that in every city in the country, all over the world. We have 1,600 training centers across the United States. And we reinvest in our workforce on a daily basis, on an annual basis, and short-term and long-term. In addition to our normal training, one of the things that we have focused a lot of attention on, when you talk about the pillars of the U.S. Conference of Mayors, you talk about the pillars of North America's Building Trades Unions, apprenticeship readiness, community workforce development, community outreach. Currently, we have 120 apprenticeship readiness programs throughout the country, and these are in partnership. We have national partners with the National Urban League, Youth Build, and others that we go into these cities and we work with the communities. We get our stakeholders set up, whether it's church groups, whether it's community groups, whether it's these national partners, and try and work out a deal, work out a pathway to bring these underserved communities. Our focus is on African American community, Latino community, women, and veterans. And through this initiative and through this effort, we have stood up 120 probably in the last decade. Some have been around longer, but have put a tremendous focus on that in the last decade and the last several years. For these to teach the skills for those to get those individuals, those underserved communities, the skills that they need to get into our apprenticeship programs. And it's it ranges anywhere from, formerly incarcerated, LA, Orange County, we have a program that is set up solely for returning citizens, to, assisting mega projects like Plant Vogel down in, Augusta, Waynesboro, Georgia. We have an apprenticeship readiness program there. With Mayor Bowser's support in Washington, D.C., we have a class going on today. Where we've got D.C. residents going through a 3-week apprenticeship readiness program, have one concurrently going in Baltimore. So that our goal is to get these residents, get these community activists, get these community members who may not have had an opportunity in the past to a shot at an apprenticeship in the building trades, to bring them into the building trades through our apprenticeship, which is going to give them a pathway to the middle class. When you look at the wage rates, the standards, the health care, the pension benefits, the training that they're getting, you get an apprenticeship, you become a journeyman in one of our trades, you're going to be firmly entrenched in the middle class. And connecting that with your support at the mayor level of trying to create a job. Our apprenticeships are based on people going to work, and it's a learn on the job. So we've got to have jobs to place them in, and that's where we partner with the city mayors and federal government to make sure that they have a place to go to work. The other thing that I mentioned was creative financing. I know you mentioned public-private partnerships. We put an increased focus on our relationship and us strengthening our relationship with our pension assets. We have $500 billion in pension assets in the country today. And working with those asset managers, going up to Wall Street, working with the people who are controlling our pension dollars to make sure that when they invest our pension dollars, that there's standards attached to that, and creating asset classifications, new funds, infrastructure funds. We've been working with Ullico for the last 5 years. We've got $1 billion in Ullico's infrastructure fund. Created tens of thousands of jobs since, as they've deployed that money, and been able to create that pathway and tying, those community jobs into these infrastructure funds. We're working with other of the major funds and these other infrastructure funds. Not all public-private partnerships are great. There's not a one-size-fits-all, but we engage where we can, where we have assets, where we have money in the table, and ensure that there's responsible contracting policy so that when the contractors are hired for the investment to build the infrastructure in your city, that it's, number one, it's going to be city residents that are going to be doing that work. Number two, it's going to have standards, safety standards, training contributions, healthcare contributions, pension contributions. So working with those and leveraging our money in that new way in which we're doing it is creating more opportunities for us as a nation, for you as a mayor to invest wisely in your city and make sure that you're getting the proper return on the investment. And finally, our advocacy tool, we started a C4 called Rebuild USA. Our goal is to create, hundreds of thousands of not only our members, but the general public as a two-way communication tool to hold, federal officials, federally elected governors, the administration, mayors, anybody who's made promises on infrastructure and the investments they're going to make. We want to use this as a tool to be able to communicate with those elected officials and talk to them about the importance of infrastructure. Because not only does it create a job, and that's what's important to me, but it creates a pathway, creates a career for a family, for someone to do that. So that's another place where we're looking for some partnership and some help in getting the word out on this Rebuild USA so that we can turn this into a tool to be an effective communication tool to hold those at the federal government responsible for some of the promises that they've made on the infrastructure investments they've talked about.
Thank you, Brent. Please give him a round of applause. We also have with us Nat Ford, Nathaniel P. Ford, the incoming chair of the American Public Transportation Association, the leading advocacy organization of public transportation in the United States and one of our primary partners. I got to know Nat when he ran the MARTA system in the city of Atlanta, and he did so ably. He subsequently ran the Muni system in San Francisco and is currently the Chief Executive Officer of the Jacksonville Transportation Authority. We are pleased to have him with us today. Nat?
All right, thank you. Mayor Landrieu, thank you for your invitation to be part of this panel, and to my good friend, Mayor Reed, it's good to see you again, and thank you for that kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be on this panel this morning, and as the mayor stated, I have a day job, which is to run the Jacksonville Transportation Authority, which is a unique organization in that we are actually an expressway authority that is combined with a public transportation authority. It's a rather unique arrangement, but it does bring a lot of perspective in terms of transportation challenges in our community and how we try to solve those. Our APTA Association, that I'll be the incoming chair of this fall, represents over 1,500 different members representing transit systems, both large and small. And a lot of you as mayors in this audience are very familiar with the work that we do with your agencies and your local governments. And we also represent private sector members, international firms that are multi-billion-dollar corporations that actually find APTA a good home in terms of advocacy for transportation in our city, in our country. I know our friends from the American Society of Civil Engineers have been producing reports as it relates to infrastructure in this country, but as it relates to my industry, the report card really points out a dismal picture. D- for transit, a C+ for bridges, and a D for roads. In transit alone, and many of you are aware, there's a significant backlog, almost $90 billion in backlog as it relates to transit maintenance, and that's per the US DOT. And it's coming at a time where US transit systems are starting to see some of the biggest gains that they've had in years. We are carrying now 10.4 billion passenger trips. That was the figure in 2016, which is a 30% increase over our actual ridership numbers 20 years ago. So at a time that we're growing and you in the very large urban areas are seeing a significant increase of folks moving back into urban centers, we are seeing challenges as it relates to increased ridership and limited infrastructure. Investment in public transportation, I think, is a shared responsibility, and that's what we're advocating at APTA, that it's a shared responsibility. And for many of us, we've seen where postponing investment in infrastructure comes back to bite us. It's a slow series of cuts, and then the crisis happens, and then we recognize that, unfortunately, the maintenance and the infrastructure investment that should have been made years ago wasn't made, and then it led us to a crisis. And so we are pushing that and advocating that, at least at a federal level, that there is a continuation of investment in terms of public transportation. And if you take a look at the slide, we've actually put at your seat copies of these slides so you can take them home with you. But what we wanted to do is show the mix of combined sources that support public transportation. The $68 billion on the pie chart represents the sum of all capital and operating budgets for our nation. And as you can see, there's not really one funding pot that is overwhelming another. It's actually a very balanced pot of funding across the board. But that federal piece is a critical piece in terms of what we need to do going into the future. This next chart that I'm bringing up also, what we're trying to do is reflect the trends in funding since 2009 from federal, state, local, and agency revenues leading up to 2015. And as you can see, at a local level and at an agency revenue level, there has been growth. We have been investing at a local level into our public transportation systems to ensure their vitality for our communities. However, at the federal level, you're not seeing that same rate of growth in terms of investment. At a local level, our voters are getting it. In fact, in 2016, they approved a record $170 billion in long-term investment for public transit. Mayor Reed, congratulations to you and the folks in Atlanta when you passed your bill guaranteeing $2.5 billion to fund major improvements into the MARTA system. And so, as the former CEO of MARTA, I know how far that funding will go, and we'll make sure that you have a very stable and solid system for your citizens in your community. On that same day, in November, LA County approved a half-cent sales tax and extended an existing half-cent traffic tax, which will generate over $120 billion. And what's interesting in terms of that bill, it's actually into perpetuity. So it goes on forever. And again, that major investment in terms of urban transportation and public transportation is clearly seen as a value by our citizens at the local level. Transportation is clearly a backbone to our communities from economic, social, demographic, and environmental trends that favor metropolitan regions in public transportation. And currently, 35 million trips are taken every day in this country for public transportation. And with a growth rate of 3 million citizens per year, coupled with continued strong trends towards urbanization, we are going to see those numbers increase. And a fact that we have always touted in terms of APTA, for every dollar that you did invest in your community, it brought you back, in terms of public transportation, it brought you back $4 in terms of economic return. The interesting thing is, quite often the discussion around public transportation is regulated to those large urban areas. What we've done, and it's also at your seat, we've actually done a skeleton or a schematic as it relates to buses and rail cars. And while they may be utilized heavily in our larger cities and communities, the actual economic impact goes into rural America. So when you look at a bus that's manufactured in North Dakota or South Dakota, or you look at my situation in Jacksonville, Florida, that when I purchase buses, actually it employs folks in South Hayward portion of Northern California, our reach in terms of public transportation goes far beyond the actual users on a daily basis. We buy tires for our buses in from Kansas and South Carolina, cooling systems in Georgia and Tennessee. Our brakes and suspension systems come from Idaho and Ohio, and transmissions are built in Indiana. So public transportation does more than just move the community that it's actually serving. We have helped to move jobs in this entire nation. We are a $68 billion industry, and every $1 billion that are invested in public transportation supports and creates more than 50,000 jobs. 70% of the public funding for public transportation flows to the private sector, creating and supporting hundreds of jobs across this country. And in an era where we talk about a return on investment and we question every dollar that is being spent, these facts are more relevant than ever. We are evolving, we are partnering with the private sector and finding new ways and higher levels of participation, and we are encouraging entrepreneurship. We're gaining greater levels of work as it relates to real estate development, transit-oriented developments, and looking for low-cost capital. But P3s alone, and I think Mayor Emanuel stated it earlier, it is not the panacea. P3s alone will not cover all of our bases. We must take a balanced approach, and that couples new strategies looking for new revenues. We compile a great deal of data in terms of public transportation, and we use a great deal of that data as presented earlier. We're using it at the JTA in Jacksonville in terms of our decisions. But I'll tell you, one of the best examples that I think all of us have seen, and it came out of the Smart Cities competition that was created by Secretary Fox, the competition that awarded Columbus, Ohio, $50 million in federal funding, which has now been leveraged into literally hundreds of millions of dollars in private investment. And I think the Columbus application came through because of the data that they used to make their case in terms of their funding. That $50 million actually is tied to helping them deal with infant mortality rates and accessibility for those mothers so that they could get to good health care, and how public transportation was part of that solution. And so I think as we go forward, partnering with cities, looking at the data issues that you're struggling with as mayors and how public transportation could help solve those problems. As partners, I think between the mayors, the cities, and public transportation, we have to work shoulder to shoulder. We have tough jobs. We make tough decisions, and we have to deliver. I like to say quite often, and as a public transit agency CEO, I'm only as good as my last rush hour. And that's a lot of what you have to deal with as mayors in terms of making sure that you solve problems on a daily basis. We're looking at APTA for ways to think outside the box and advocate our message. We'd like to partner with you. Immediately after Secretary Chao was named as the new DOT secretary, we were in her offices helping to try and shape opinion around public transportation. And we are engaging our members of Congress as we work across the country. So in the next few weeks, we expect to have a meeting with the infrastructure czar, DJ Gribbin, to start talking about public transportation and investment in our communities. With that, in closing, I just want to say that I think there's strength in numbers, and thank you for the opportunity to make these few comments, and look forward to working with you going into the future. Thank you.
Thank you for your remarks. We will now have our panelist who has a very unique perspective. She is an engineering professor here at the University of New Orleans and the president of the American Society of Civil Engineers. Dr. Norma Jean Mattei, the ACE's oldest, leads the ACE, and it's the nation's oldest professional engineering association with over 150,000 people in all 50 states and a growing international membership. In the policy arena, ASCE is best known for its quadrennial infrastructure report card. Our conference has worked with them to spread the message on infrastructure investment since 2001. Dr. Norma Jean Mattei is currently president of this organization and professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the University of New Orleans. She has served as a member of the Mississippi River Commission since President Obama appointed her in 2012. She is also a member of Mayor Landrieu's Fix My Streets Financing Working Group. Please welcome Dr. Norma Jean Mattei.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for inviting me, and welcome to New Orleans. I am a native New Orleanian, born and raised, and I've never lived anywhere else, so I hope that you take the time to enjoy my city. Thank you again for inviting me. I know I am not a political figure, but I did get elected president of my professional organization, and as was mentioned, that's 150,000 engineers, not only in the United States, but globally. Nate, thank you for mentioning the report card. I wasn't going to bring that up, but it is a tool that My organization, since 1998, has put together every 4 years. It's a tool that lets not only decision makers on the Hill, decision makers in governor's seats, but mayors and the general public know what the status or condition of the infrastructure that they rely on for their quality of life. So we look every 4 years at 16 different categories of infrastructure. Some of that infrastructure is clearly in your wheelhouse: drinking water, wastewater. Some of it's clearly of federal interest: inland waterways, dams. And so we look at these not separate projects, but these 16 categories as an aggregate, so not separate projects, across the country. So transit's one of them. Transit was the bad boy this year. So the worst player, D-. The best, a B, so that no A's, the B was rail. Rail, the past 4 years, has put a lot of money into the rail system. Now, I'm not talking about light rail. I'm talking about Amtrak falls into this, but I'm talking primarily about freight rail. So rail, primarily private investment. 2015, $15 billion alone. So those folks were getting ready for the Panama Canal expansion, how things were going to be shifted around the country, so perhaps rail could take advantage of where goods were being brought into the country from different places than traditionally. They also were getting ready for fracking. Remember fracking? We as a country now have capabilities of acquiring energy in places that we never have before. No pipeline lines were there. And so in order to move that product, we were relying on rail. That required a lot of investment from that industry. Transit, the bad player, we're having more and more people move into cities. We have more and more people relying on transit. We have transit, but it's getting older. There's a lot of bright spots in transit from a project point of view, but overall, when you look at it as an aggregate, we are not investing in transit, and it is showing. When you look at the grades, and it's a typical report card, A is good, F is not, and most of those grades are Ds. If you look at overall what this country, when it's normalized according to our GDP, we are in line with Greece. That is not good. So I'd like to give you another tool other than our report card. So if you want to go to the App Store, you can download the app, Save America's Infrastructure, and that actually you can then look at where the numbers came from, look at different categories, and it also breaks it down by state and then sometimes by city. So the average American spends 34 hours in traffic a year, but in Los Angeles, that's 104 hours. That's a lot of time. That's more than their 2-week vacation. They would rather probably spend that time somewhere else. So that brings up that other tool that you can use when trying to talk to your public and try to impart on them the importance of investing in infrastructure is when they go to vote perhaps on funding of infrastructure in your city. And that is, they are paying for poor infrastructure, whether they think about it or not. So on average, the average American family is spending $3,400 out of their discretionary income because of poor infrastructure. So they are sitting in traffic instead of being at work. They are spending more of their discretionary income on goods because it simply takes more money to get those goods from where it's produced to where they purchase them. So that might be something that you can use when you're discussing what the benefits are of investment in infrastructure. So I'll move to perhaps some recommendations that my organization has when it comes to infrastructure, because we were really tasked with looking at what we should be doing when talking to Congress and the administration on this federal investment package. So that investment has to really be placed substantially, but it must have long-term benefits. So long-term benefits not only to the public's health, safety, and welfare, but to the health of the economy. We have to remind Congress and the administration that clearly they must recognize that there is a federal role in infrastructure investment, that not all infrastructure is going to be successfully infused with monies from P3s. P3s are just another tool in the toolbox. And in some cases, you really need to have the authority to enter into that agreement with a private, with that private funder. So sometimes that is a big barrier in entering into a P3 agreement. Also, we recommend that those projects are sustainable and that they are also innovative. So as civil engineers, we deal with standards and codes, and sometimes those standards and codes put in place to protect the public may get in the way of innovation. And so how do we wisely and safely innovate and allow for new materials, new construction techniques, for innovation to move forward and be able to get more bang for that buck, that precious buck. And finally, we need to use those federal dollars to leverage state and local monies. One of the things that we do recommend, well, two things that we do recommend. We do recommend to revamp the gas tax. It is a way to fund surface transportation. It has not been increased since 1993. I wouldn't want to be living on my $1993, and it has not been indexed to inflation. And another thing that we would recommend is if any project has federal dollars in it, and it's over $5 million in totality, that life cycle cost assessment is used in developing that project. Because you mayors know that you can get a project in the ground, but if you don't have monies available to maintain it, and you have to maintain it to keep it in good condition year after year, then you're going to end up having to throw a whole heck of a lot of money later on when you have run that project into the ground. So life cycle cost assessment is a way of looking at these things in a long term, because if you look at the life cycle of most civil infrastructure, a good percentage of that total cost is in operating and maintaining, not in just getting it into the ground in the first place. So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to be here, and again, welcome to New Orleans.
Thank you, Dr. Matei, for that warm welcome. Our final speaker today is a gentleman named Ray Klatch. Ray is the managing director and co-founder of American Public Infrastructure, API. He was formerly with Citigroup and has nearly 40 years of investment banking experience, specializing in infrastructure and public-private partnerships. API is a new infrastructure fund, serving U.S. public pension funds in obtaining and managing public infrastructure, initially through asset-in-kind contributions. Ray is here to introduce the new American infrastructure model, an approach that overcomes two key obstacles to P3s in America. One is a fear of private or alien control of core infrastructure in our cities, and two is a significant jump in capital costs related to the projects. Ray, welcome.
Thank you, Mayor. As the mayor pointed out, I'm a recovering merchant of debt, which means that After 40 years of loading up our states and municipalities with debt, we came to the conclusion that that cities and states needed different solutions, and I couldn't be here on a more timely basis because Brookings just released a book called Hidden Wealth of Cities. I'm sure that many of you saw it listed in Governing Magazine. Just like Margaret Thatcher pivoted in the late 70s, early 80s to privatization, and which swept across Britain as well as Europe. We're at a point in time now, not just because of our infrastructure problems, but as bankers, we look at the whole balance sheet, and as you all know, many of the balance sheets have growing unfunded pension liabilities and costs that are budget costs that are growing at higher pace than your revenues. All of that is putting tremendous amount of pressure both on the local level and on the state level. And the worst news is the federal government's even worse off. If you look at the federal government balance sheet, it's once you take the $20 billion worth of debt and then add entitlements and pensions, it's well over $100 trillion of liabilities. So I'm not optimistic of state and local governments seeing a lot out of the infrastructure bill. I do think that mayors should be cautious in with their lobbyists on the Hill to understand the difference between the two F words. One is funding and the other one is financing. I think the administration's going to focus on financing, and in order to get increase in net infrastructure investment, financing generally doesn't do it. Funding does. So, I applaud Mayor Emanuel on all of his efforts in Chicago to shore up both the infrastructure as well as the pensions. One of the first pages of all of our presentations is that America does not have a shortage of capital or financing tools, but we are stuck in a situation where we can't make a decision as to who's going to pay for it as far as infrastructure. Mayor Emanuel has done great things with both. He outlined his infrastructure initiatives, but he's also done a tremendous job of shoring up our pension plans, albeit there's more work to be done. When it comes to
Thanks, sir. I appreciate it.
But when it comes to this, and I've heard the mayor speak with the DJ Gribbon at the Wall Street Journal Forum, and he used the word fairy dust, and I think it is important to distinguish between fairy dust and real solutions. And we represented Macquarie in the acquisition of Chicago Skyway and the Indiana Toll Road, and also represented the city of Indianapolis, Mayor Ballard, in the sale of the water and sewer assets of Indianapolis to a community trust called Citizens Energy. A community trust in this case is very similar to what Mayor Emanuel set up in Chicago with the Infrastructure Trust. It benefits from preserving tax-exempt financing. So Mayor Ballard, when he transferred and sold the Indiana Water and Sewer for $1.9 billion to Citizens Energy, $1.4 billion of debt remained outstanding as tax-exempt debt, plus he raised $500 million for infrastructure. But he preceded that with a year-long infrastructure inventory, came up with a list of $1.5 billion worth of critical projects, and there was overwhelming community support for this transfer in P3, as well as support from the labor community. Mayor Mitch Daniels, with his privatization, or P3, I should say, of the Indiana Toll Road, took $3 billion of proceeds from that road, combined it with state and federal dollars, as well as new leveraging. That $3 billion acted as the equity for a bunch of leveraging, was able to finance $10 billion worth of roads. So there are good P3s, and working with the public pension funds of the country, they have $3.5 trillion worth of dollars to invest, of which they want to invest about 5% of that in infrastructure, which is about $175 billion. Today, because the infrastructure they want to invest in, they do not want to invest in new start projects, greenfield projects where there's risk. They want core infrastructure that's seasoned and proven. So currently, most of that money is going abroad because they can't find that infrastructure in the United States. We've been working with the public pension funds. They very much want to work with the municipalities within their states as well as across borders to invest in infrastructure, and asset-in-kind contributions is a vehicle that is growingly popular with them. What does that mean? That the municipality contributes the asset in lieu of payment or in addition to payments to the pension fund. The pension fund becomes the owner of the asset. The manager is a qualified infrastructure asset manager. The operator is going to be an industry, top quality industry professional picked by RFP as far as whether it's water, highways, electricity. All will be top quality private industry firms bringing private innovation and bottom line orientation. Rank and file is held harmless, although many of these agreements will have attrition for savings in the future. And, but that said, it's not a silver bullet. I mean, there's a lot to be done. As far as asset-in-kind contributions of infrastructure or public assets, the state of Queensland transferred their total asset to their pension fund for $3.1 billion in 2003. 4 years later, after it's been commercialized and improved and made into a revenue-generating enterprise, the Queensland Pension Fund sold it for 7.1 billion Australian. Most recently, and I'm sure that very few people in this room know, the largest asset-in-kind contribution was enacted by the state of New Jersey. They're transferring their state lottery to the state pension fund for its estimated amount of $13 billion. In order to make this a universal solution for all, to make this solution applicable to all public pension funds, there are a couple of glitches in the IRS code. Under the IRS code, CalSTRS, California Teachers, qualifies under the definition of government instrumentality. However, CalPERS doesn't. So we're working with the federal government to enact regulatory changes so this can be done in all states and all municipalities. And with that, as far as the federal legislation, I'd just like to say that I think the best plan is to go in with supporting a wide array of tools that help us all, including repatriation, expansion of PABs, alternative delivery, and I think that's the best way to get the best response. Additionally, coming up with something that's similar to the Race to the Top, where local governments and states can do interesting asset recycling in order to capture more federal dollars, I think is something to be very mindful of, because it will be a high priority of the administration to demonstrate quick action. And your brownfield assets, your assets that you already own, are a source of great wealth. Thank you.
Thank you for your remarks. We have about 15 minutes to open the floor to questions from any mayor who would like to participate. For the benefit of our speakers, please identify yourself and your city before we start asking questions to our infrastructure corner, our distinguished panel of speakers today. Yes.
Mayor Paul Sokolin, Madison, Wisconsin. We've had a proposal in our legislature to put an additional tax on electric vehicles. The logic being that since they don't consume gasoline, they're not paying for roads. The contrary view is that because of their carbon footprint, we should be encouraging the purchase of these vehicles. Have any of you given any thought to this? Any opinions?
Thank you for the question. A couple of thoughts, and I've got to be careful here because I'm sitting here with two hats on also, because, you know, as an agency head who funds a great deal of his operation from a gas tax, we've been watching this very closely because most recently we received an extension of our gas tax to help fund our agency's operations. But in that examination of the funding and revenue over the next 20 years, we recognize that, yes, population is growing. There may be more folks driving gas-powered cars. The actual curve in terms of electric vehicles and their acceptance actually works against you in terms of that. And so with that being said, we are looking at an examination in terms of how do you capture that value out of electric vehicles, but it may open the door to really have an open discussion regarding VMT, and actual vehicle miles traveled may be the more stable funding mechanism going forward, and that will also help as it relates to some of the private operators that we see coming into our space. So when you talk about the Ubers, the Lyfts, and some of the TNCs, they also are not actually contributing to the infrastructure that you provide, the roads that you're providing them for them to make a, you know, a private entity to make a profit on. And so with that being said, maybe that is the opportunity in the introduction of VMT as it relates to electric vehicles and maybe these private TNCs. So that's our thoughts, not necessarily the thoughts of the American Public Transportation Association, but as incoming chair, it is clearly one of the things that I want to discuss with my colleagues around the country.
Mayor Bowser.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you to all the panelists. And I loved what you all had to say. I think our focus, at least two that I'd like to recommend that the conference move forward with, is also reminding the federal government that they have federal transportation assets of their own. And there has been a push, I think, to have the states and local governments throw the federal assets into our request to US DOT or Federal Highway. We have a bridge that connects Virginia and Washington that nobody wants to take responsibility for, and it belongs to Park Service. But Park Service has those bridges all over the nation, so I would be mindful of that. The second thing I think that we should continue to focus on is regions that work cooperatively should rise to the top. In our city, for example, the Washington Metro system is jointly owned through a compact with Washington, D.C., Virginia, and Maryland. And we're having a pretty difficult argument right now about consistent long-term funding. The federal government really does have a role in that because they can encourage through incentives or disincentives each jurisdiction to be able to work together to come to some agreements around how we fund our systems. So I think that's really important when we talk about infrastructure, that if there are competitions, which I would be supportive of, that there will be some incentive for regions to work together.
Thank you, Mayor. Would you all like to comment on the mayor's comment? All right. Are there any other members that have questions? Yes.
Pete Buttigieg, South Bend, Indiana. We're one of those cities that's big enough to have public transportation, but not dense enough for it to be very strong. Sometimes I try to practice what I preach and take the bus into work, but because it only runs once an hour and it's done at 5 or 6 in the evening, I don't do it that often. Last time I did it, I noticed about 3 or 4 other people on the bus headed into downtown at rush hour, and started doing the napkin math, and we realized that our system pays something like $4 or $5 per mile per passenger before you even get into the paratransit. And of course, it crosses your mind to compare that to the cost of just putting them in a Lyft or an Uber. I'm not suggesting we do that, but I do want to ask, now that we're past the sort of initial disruption and or romance phase with ride sharing, and it's gotten to be comparatively mature, have we come to grips with what the sharing economy ought to mean for our transportation planning, especially when it comes to public transportation in the medium to long run?
I think it's coming my way again.
I think so, too.
Thank you for that question. I think the TNCs are an opportunity for public transportation because quite often it's the last mile that we have the challenge with. We do very well where we have heavy ridership corridors, direct A to B type of trips. It's around A and around B that we may have the challenge. And so I think it's good we have entrants coming into our space that we can partner with. We want to make sure, though, in delivery of these services that the TNCs do not cherry pick the choice riders, and then the transit system is left with those riders who do not have a choice. And so there needs to be some coalescence around there, some coordination around that. And when you look at transportation, be it bikes, pedestrians, you name it, it's a holistic system approach. And while I'm representing public transportation, I'm very versed in terms of all of the modes of transportation our citizens need in cities. And so you can't push one versus the other. They need to work in harmony. And as it relates to just ridership in terms of transit systems in mid-sized cities, so to speak, about 3 years ago, in 2014, we did a major route optimization initiative in Jacksonville, where we totally wiped the slate clean and replaced our existing system with totally new route structure, because over a 30-year period, we did not keep up with that. And unfortunately, each bus stop has its constituency, and each route has its constituency. And so it's very difficult to do. And I think that is now the trend that a lot of us are doing across the country, which is really wiping the slate clean and redesigning our systems to fit the current origins and destinations of our riders.
I have just a quick question and a comment. I know that you have a young population, and young populations, this won't work for your elderly, but they tend to really lean toward biking. Do you allow bikes on the bus?
Yeah, we have, and we found that by far the most promising kind of last mile adjacency is to find a biking solution. It is pretty cold in South Bend, although we learned, a few of us were on a delegation where we saw how much the Danish use bikes. They have a saying, that it rhymes in Danish, they say there's no such thing as bad weather, just bad clothing. But I'm not sure we've gotten that mentality to penetrate northern Indiana just yet.
Responding to Mayor Bowser about the federal government, a couple of things. One is they do lecture the states and the municipalities on a regular basis about P3s and being more innovative and getting into the current century. However, as you know, the federal government has done very little along those lines. So, I mean, they're progressing, but they've got a long way to go. So as you're lectured this next go-around on infrastructure, it'd be good to lecture them back as far as their own infrastructure. And more importantly, their budgeting, they do cash accounting on capital projects, whereas we all do long-term debt and long-term capital investment. So just going to a 10-year schedule on federal expenditures on capital would free up tremendous amount of money for state and local infrastructure, which is another thing to push back on as you meet with Congress in the next several months.
Thank you. If I could just add, Mayor, to that and share with all the mayors, one thing that I think has been very helpful to us is that our CFO has looked at all of our assets, down to sidewalks, our public buildings, jails, schools, and the whole nine. So we know where they are in the investment of maintenance, of their maintenance cycle, which is giving us a number. And we know what it is, and we know how much we have to raise each year to be able to support that. And that has just meant just a great deal to the financial strength of the city. And so we want to do the same thing with the federal assets, so that we can tell them, if you're going to be able to keep up like the city can keep up with its assets, this is what it's going to take. The last thing that I wanted to mention is that when I talk about infrastructure, and the mayor and the conference can consider this, I always include public housing. And if we're not going to have it in this discussion, I think that it has to be part of something that we're communicating, because just in Washington, D.C. alone, we have 8,000 public housing units, compared to other cities, that's a small number, but we can't afford to lose a single one of them. And as far as I can see, HUD is not interested in any sort of investment. And we've been trying to figure out public-private investments in our public housing portfolio, and if there are some ideas around the table that are working, we are very interested to learn from you.
Thank you. It's a very good conversation. Go ahead. Ron?
I just want to bring two parts of a conversation together. And this deals with, look, I think one of our challenges as cities is how do we create inclusive growth? And maybe this is a major city issue. I don't think it is. But we got, I told you about some data points like the economic growth in the city, but we also have some huge pockets of poverty. And the proximity between growth and poverty is only a mile or two. And when I did our water fee to pay for the water infrastructure I was talking about, I then pushed the building trades on training as it related to underserved communities, so that people were going to be paying more for more work being done in the city. The trades were opening up to underserved communities for training, journeyman apprenticeships, et cetera. And I think one of the things, we're all trying to figure out where do we get the money to do what we got to do. And sometimes we have to talk to our own residents about coughing up, because I don't see the federal government, to be honest. I think we should be honest in this table, anytime soon coming to the rescue and all of a sudden realizing, regardless of the president's rhetoric, of desire and hope to do that. And the question is, going to a diverse city with different capacities and strengths, but also different access to opportunity. We all know what infrastructure and public transportation does in the sense of access, and then using, I think, what Brent said here. We had breakfast this morning. I've done one kind of project on the water, but talking about how do we make doors of opportunity to the trades a place where kids of color have not really had a history of being accessed, and using the investments we're doing on infrastructure to be both not only an opportunity to unlock all this private sector investment, but then also an opportunity to open up the building trades as a place where kids and young adults who have not historically had a chance to get a chance at not just a good job, a good paying job, but a career that can support a middle-class family. And I think somehow, there's a lot to this conversation. Obviously, I think we could all sit here for hours, but how do we kind of create economic opportunity that's inclusive growth rather than it becoming a barrier to growth? We all could sit here, and I know I could, talk about things that are happening dynamically in our city that we want others to know. But I got to tell you, the thing I scratch my head around all day long is how do you get this growth to be not something people look at as if it's in a foreign city when it's only a mile away from where they live. And I think infrastructure, trades, we got people coming out of retirement to work in the trades because they're short workers. And this is actually an opportunity to serve and scratch two problems, not one. And so I don't have an answer. I have a big heart to try to figure it out, man. But I think this is one we can do a lot to serve two kind of challenges. I think whatever side city we have, we all got this problem.
And just to follow up, and I appreciate your comments, and I think you're spot on as far as what our role in this is. And our role is in what we do best is skills training. And it's not for a job, and Mayor Emanuel just said it's for a career in construction. But the only way you make that career in construction is you build a pipeline of work. Whether you're refurbishing the schools in the city of Chicago, to building a light rail, to building a high-speed rail, when you go through that and you look at a 20-year career, you could have worked on all those things. and a robust investment in infrastructure where you're tying requirements, whether it's city residents, whether it's African American community, Latino community, women, veterans, all things that are areas of our focus, that we put requirements on the contracting on that, where the city is not using its own employees, but you're hiring outside contractors to do that, to put benchmarks in there that you have to do it, that puts the onus squarely on our shoulders at the trades to say, we're committed with you, we're partnering with you, now we've got to work together, Mr. or Madam Mayor, to go identify those communities. You know, these communities, as we stand right now, their economic fortune is based on the zip code in which they were born in. And we've got to change that dynamic. And we think that we are a part of that. We're not the only solution, but we certainly feel like we are a part of that solution where we can sit down at the table, we can work with you and say, let's go identify who these stakeholders are. How do we create that ladder of opportunity in the middle class to do a building trades job?
Sure, and then we're going to close out with Mayor Barnett after you. No, hold on, wait a minute. Go ahead and speak. This is a good part of the conversation.
I wish my wife would say that once in a while. On a serious, look, here's the thing. We still in Chicago, 14% of our employment is manufacturing. But we know what's, I mean, even on a good day, it's not going to be what it was once. The one thing I know about what we're doing at our airports, mass transit, our schools and our parks, and our water system, it can't get outsourced. And the draw of Chicago, the draw of Cleveland, the draw of Milwaukee or South Bend was always, in the Great Migration, was a good paying job in manufacturing. That's not coming back. I mean, we're doing all we can. It's not that it's going away. It's actually becoming a computer skills set. And so it's also going to become a sector that becomes, I wouldn't say walled off, but harder to access rather than open for access. The one thing I do know is that the trades, you cannot outsource, you cannot third party it, you cannot send it overseas to be done. And if we're going to make sure that the third generation of children that were part of the Great Migration have a chance like their grandparents did when they came to Chicago or they came to any city in the Midwest, and also now returning back to Atlanta, is I think the building trades and our infrastructure, and I also think we can challenge the president in this very particular way because of what he talks about sometimes, I'd say hopefully, is to make the infrastructure investment part of our economic strategy of inclusive economic growth. And I do think it has appeal, not just rhetorically, but reality, to kids that we're now going to have a job and a career. And it's not going to be in manufacturing, even though all of us individually work on that project and trying to do that. And that's my, I think, we've got an idea we're going to cook around where summer internships at our training facilities, building trades facilities in the summer, and I'll pay their salaries. So if going back in on the summer job, we will pay their salaries if they go to the training facilities, you know, plumbers, electrical workers, carpenters, laborers, et cetera, so that then when they graduate high school, they're as close to damn near apprentice ready as you can get them. I mean, I'm just looking for anything to trying to give these kids a chance at something that they see happen around them.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we have to do on another day is we're going to have to grapple with the fact that the things that if we were to go around this table and tout about our cities, they're making our cities more expensive for regular people. So if you were just to go mayor by mayor and we were to have a conversation about the most exciting things we're doing, they actually make our city rougher for regular folks to stay in them. And so, Mayor Benjamin, I know you want us to close out, so I want to go to Mayor Barnett, but I hope that, Tom, on another day at another time, we can really get in a room and start grappling with the fact that the success of cities is really making them tough for regular folks. And in every meeting I'm in with mayors, everybody's dealing with it. Yeah. And so, and I know we have a heart for it.
Absolutely. And before Brian wraps us up, I think this may be our last formal setting before we gather again like this, that we'll have Kasim Reed here as the mayor of Atlanta. And I got to tell you guys, over the last several years on issues of transportation, incredible innovation happening in communications, having him as the chair of our Transportation and Communications Committee and just a leader nationally and globally on so many different issues, pension reform, hit the ground running. Hope and pray that when Kasim Reed comes back, he'll come back as the governor of Georgia. So we'll see how that goes. A round of applause for Mayor Reed, and thank you for our panelists. Mayor Barnett, please.
Thank you, Mayor Benjamin, and absolutely true. Mayor Reed, your leadership has been on point and focused, and something I think we all appreciate. You deal with this a lot more than we do when we come together and have it as an agenda topic. I know you're working on it throughout the months in between those meetings. Listen, I think Mayor Emanuel's points were well taken, and I think there's one cautionary tale that we should be mindful of as we look to advocate for infrastructure funding, and that is how we're going to pay for it. And if one of the challenges we have is making sure that what we do doesn't make it more expensive, and we're looking at inclusive economic growth. When we were in Washington, the very first thing that the legislative leaders talked about in terms of funding infrastructure was doing it through tax reform and eliminating state and local tax deductions, and ultimately making it more expensive for most of the folks that live in our community. And so we have to be, I think, highly focused on not just talking about the need. We all have needs. We all have, projects. We could drive to any corner of our town and talk about where we could spend money, but we have to talk with a very refined focus about where we think that money should come from, because ultimately, if it cost our taxpayers more through tax reform, it seemed to be the very first thing we talked to, the very first thing they offered up. Even still, Mayor Benjamin, your sacrosanct work on muni bonds is still not off the table when it comes to how I think the federal government thinks they're going to find money for infrastructure. But we talk about the need. We also have to talk about where we think the appropriate funding sources will come from, and I think that's just as important as we move forward. Thanks.
Take a brief lunch break, y'all. We got a very short break, and then we're going to start the next discussion at 12:45. Lunch is where breakfast was, I believe, right here behind us. Is that right, Tom? So let's dive in and dive right back into a substantive discussion. Thank y'all.
Yeah, no, I'm going to be here till tomorrow. What are you doing?